Sheesh, so Avatar Legends core rulebook has 300 pages. That's way too intimidating for getting newer players into the game. Later videos will cover knowledge gaps and GM information. This video is just designed so you can get as much understanding as needed to be a mostly competent player in your first session. Before getting into anything else, head over to Magpie Games' website and go grab their free corebook PDFs. We'll be using these resources throughout the video, and regardless, they're great to have. Every tabletop role-playing game that I'm aware of has two core elements to the game: the conversation and the dice. The conversation is, well, a conversation. It's a verbal game of catch between player and GM. The GM provides the players with information, the players respond to that information, possibly triggering a roll, and the GM gives them new information based on whatever it is that they just did. Another concept we'll be referencing often is the fiction. The fiction is the, well, fictional world that you're playing in. It's both the group's collective memory of everything that's happened in the past and everyone's collective understanding of what's currently happening in the present. When people refer to role-playing games as adult make-believe, they're talking about the fiction. But the fiction is why we play the game. It's not just fantastical, it's believable. Not realistic, but believable. If I demand a king give me their crown, a GM working towards a believable fiction would mean that at best I'm laughed at, and at worst, my head should cherish the time it still has connected to my neck. The fiction may seem an amorphous concept, and it kind of is, but you should pick it up rather quickly, especially if you're playing with people who have played TTRPGs before. Avatar Legends is a narrative-focused game, so we're going to be learning a lot of its mechanics through character creation, rather than creating a character based on our understanding of the mechanics. That said, before we can even start with creating our character, we need to know a couple things. What's the world they live in? What's their goal in regard to the other companions? And what are some general expectations around your character as a whole? To help define the when and where of our companions, the wonderful people at Magpie Games have outlined 5 distinct eras of the Avatarverse's history. In most cases, your GM's going to pick the era before you start the game, so I'm not going to take the time to go through all of them, but if you want an outline of all of them and kind of their general struggles, you can head to page 108 for that. Next, you'll need an inciting incident. This is Katara unfreezing Aang, Zahir becoming an airbender. Whatever critical moment jump starts the main conflict into motion. As with choosing an era, your GM likely has this chosen before the game has started, but you guys should still talk about it before you create characters. It might feel strange that this is happening before you've even started the game. Firstly, it doesn't have to. You're more than free to talk about the inciting incident beforehand, and then actually play through that incident in your first session. Regardless, it's really helpful for both the players and the GMs to outline the inciting incident early for 2 core reasons. The first is that GMs will know that players will play into their plot hooks. I cannot tell you how many times as a DM I have placed a plot hook in front of the players, and they've decided, I'm just not interested in doing that. And secondly, the players can make characters that relate to the core conflict of the story, making them feel more important in the world. Once you've identified the problem that needs to be solved, your group needs to decide how you're going to go about solving it. The game calls this a group focus, so go ahead and gather around with your fellow players and decide why you guys are working together and what it is you're working together to do. This should be in direct relation to the inciting incident. The last thing you should get into before creating characters is determine what kind of game you're playing. Are you guys playing a high-stakes, no-nonsense game? Are you playing a really light-hearted game with plenty of cabbage carts to topple? Likely your group's going to fall somewhere in the middle of those two extremes, but you should still discuss it before starting. More importantly, here are some expectations that are built into the game and its rules. You can definitely create a character from outside of these expectations, but this should be heavily discussed with the GM and your fellow players before you commit to any ideas. Characters are broken down in this game into playbooks. While playbooks do outline some mechanics your character will have access to, you shouldn't really think of them as classes. Playbooks are more akin to choosing an internal struggle that your character will have. Again, narrative game, narrative classes. There are 10 playbooks to go over, and I'm trying to keep things brief, so head on over to page 165 of the core rules. I would suggest picking a playbook based on these descriptions alone, or at least using these descriptions as primary motivators. If you need any secondary motivators, here are the Last Airbender and Korra characters that I think could fit into these playbooks. Playbooks are pretty open-ended in their descriptions. Toph could easily fit into Hammer or Prodigy, so don't feel like you have to play a character similar in personality to what's laid out here. These are for inspiration and should not be considered definitions of the playbook. Also, as a quick note, there can be no duplicate playbooks among the companions. Every single player needs to choose a unique one. Once you've chosen a playbook, go to the resources we downloaded earlier, find the pages for the playbook you chose, there should be 2, and print those out. We're now going to start walking through the playbook section by section to teach you what all these things mean. I'll be using the Prodigy as my example. The background boxes are vague terms to describe what your character did before joining the companions. You'll choose 2, which either represent 2 traits or 2 different times in your character's backstory. For example, if you were to recreate Zuko, you could choose both Privileged and Outlaw, representing his time in the Fire Nation versus his time as a wanted fugitive. You can choose one, multiple, or no demeanors and make up your own. This is entirely a roleplay decision for flavor, so no correct decisions here, just how do you think your character generally acts. And now we get to the meat and potatoes, your training. Water, earth, fire, air, weapons, or technology. Page 117 has more info on trainings if you're interested, but this is all pretty self-explanatory. Pick one training and that determines how your character both interacts with the world and how they fight. While this choice does have some mechanical implications, don't worry about those. Avatar Legends is not primarily concerned with combat, so just pick whatever sounds cool to you. Fighting style is the flavor of the training you chose. If you chose weapons, you can outline which weapon you most often like to use, or if you're a bender, you can detail how your character typically likes to manipulate their element. Again, page 117 has some awesome suggestions on fighting styles if you need either inspiration or guidance. Statuses will be covered once we get to the player reference sheet. For now, know that a game rule or your GM will explicitly outline when you mark or clear a status. The mechanical effect of a condition is outlined immediately under it. Game rules and your GM will explicitly outline when to mark conditions, and clearing them is typically done in the same way. That said, there are specified, albeit unhealthy, ways to clear each condition outlined on the back of your playbook. These 4 stats determine what bonuses or penalties you get when you make certain rolls. Anytime you roll in the game, you're using 2d6. Often you'll be asked to roll with a stat, such as roll with harmony. In this case, you'll roll 2d6, add the 2 dice together, add the number in your harmony stat, and this is your roll result. When first creating your character, you'll simply copy the red numbers to the right of each stat into the circle to the left of each stat. From there, you can choose to increase one of those numbers by +1. For example, bringing a +1 to a +2 or a -1 to a 0. Importantly, you can't increase a stat to +3 through this method. +2 is the highest you can go at this moment. As has been reiterated, don't feel like there's a correct stat to increase. Just make the choice that feels either right or interesting for your character. Fatigue boxes are marked as you become emotionally or physically injured. Typically speaking, the less fatigue you have, the better. As with statuses and conditions, it will be explicitly outlined to you when to mark or clear fatigue. If you've marked all 5 fatigue boxes, there are a couple things you should keep in mind. Firstly, anytime a game rule gives you the choice between marking fatigue and doing something else, you have to do something else. Next, if a move requires fatigue in order to use it, can't use that move. And lastly, if someone or something inflicts fatigue on you when you're already at full, you have to mark the same number of conditions instead. This isn't even in my script, but for anyone wondering, if you have 5 fatigue and 5 conditions marked, you get knocked out. While there are many actions to clear fatigue individually, the group can also clear fatigue as a whole by resting. If you get some time away from the action, you can clear fatigue off screen as shown here. Balance is one of the most complicated systems in the game. That's not to say that it's hard to understand, there's just a lot of rules that touch it. I think this information is good to know, but it's something to learn once you have a couple sessions under your belt. For now, I'm going to give you guys just enough information to get the ball rolling. To quickly note, the playbooks don't have a great way of tracking your balance, or fatigue for that matter, on the physical sheet itself. I would suggest making a simplified balance track and fatigue bar on the margins of your paper, and then using a loosened paper clip to mark where on those tracks you are. And getting back to mechanics, these are your 2 principles. They can be thought of as the 2 ideals playing tug of war in your head. This is your center. It starts at 0 and will likely stay there during your first few sessions. Go ahead and fill in the diamond by the 0. Your GM may ask you to shift your balance in one of 4 ways. You could shift toward your principal, away from your principal, toward your center, or away from your center. If any of these actions are asked of you, simply move the paperclip once in the defined direction. If you're asked to move away from your center while your paperclip is currently at center, you choose which way it goes. Lastly, you may be asked to reset your balance. If this is asked at any point, just move your paperclip back to wherever your center is marked. On the back of your playbook, you'll find look, hometown, and history. These are all roleplay based prompts, so no correct answers here. Connections is also roleplay based, but you'll fill this out after everyone has created their character and introduced them to each other. Again, no worries about mechanics across any of these 4 sections. Moment of balance and growth are related to advancement. I would completely ignore moment of balance for now, and your GM will guide you through the growth section at the end of the session. That's your playbook for now. You may have noticed that we skipped pretty much the entire bottom half of your front page and the fighting techniques section on your back page. We'll come back to these sections at the end of the video. You're going to need some more game knowledge before they make much sense. Next up, let's grab the player and combat reference sheets from the play materials. I suggest every player has 1 copy of each. The moves on the player reference sheet list the actions that any PC can take outside of combat regardless of their playbook. Each move is a set of rules that resolve conflicts, answer questions, and push the story forward. You can think of them as your input-output statements of the game. When you do X, then why? There's a concept in this game stating in order to do it, do it. This means that you never trigger a mechanic for the sake of triggering a mechanic. You must justify the mechanic with a corresponding action in the fiction. You can't simply say, I'd like to intimidate the guard. You need to describe how you intimidate the guard. Conversely, if you take an action in the fiction that the GM reads as intimidating, you might trigger this move without intending to. Every move except for help and lose your balance require rolling dice. As a quick refresher, you're going to roll 2d6, add the results together, then add the corresponding stat if there is a stat listed. There are other ways that you can get bonuses or suffer penalties when rolling, but you'll never roll with more than a +4 or less than a -3, no matter how many modifiers you have on the roll. As for the moves themselves, we're throwing most of them out. As said earlier, your actions in the fiction trigger moves, so we're not going to worry about poking and prodding to get moves to work. Your GM will let you know if you've triggered a move, and you can read the reference sheet from there. I'm only covering these moves as I feel they have more specific triggers or actions that are noteworthy. Assess a situation is most often triggered when you're trying to gather information in a tense situation. The move can't give you any information that your character wouldn't realistically have access to. If there's a secret door that the character doesn't know about, you're not going to learn about the secret door just because you asked, what's my best way in? Whatever answer you get to your question gets +1 ongoing. This means you'll get +1 to any rolls related to the information that you gathered through this move. If you use the move to identify the most dangerous enemy, you'll have a +1 in combat-related rolls against that enemy. While we're on the topic, you'll notice that Trick has a very similar keyword called +1 forward. This is almost identical to +1 ongoing, but it only works on the next immediately related roll rather than all related rolls. As with all the moves, you need to make sure you are justifying how within the fiction you are helping a companion. Also to note, while one character can't help more than once on the same move, multiple allies can help on the same move, giving +1 for each ally that assists. Importantly, each ally would need to mark 1 fatigue individually, so it's costly, but if it's an important roll, Live Up to Your Principle is the only balance move I'm covering. Again, we'll dive into the rest once we're ready to learn about balance a little bit more, but for now, know that your GM will let you know if you have triggered or can trigger one of the other balance moves. Live Up to Your Principle is manually triggered by you when one of your principles could apply to a role. Maybe my prodigy has lead toward their community principle, so I could use Live Up to My Principle when guiding and comforting an ally, so I get +2 instead of using my 0 in harmony. This is a very rare outlier move where you're specifically invoking a mechanic, though it does still need to be justified in the fiction. So that's why I wanted to point this one out. Another page down, let's get to the fun stuff, combat. This game is not primarily about combat. While there are combat rules known as the exchange system, the GM is actually encouraged to save exchanges for only the bigger fights. Exchanges likely won't be invoked when running into some random bandits on the side of the road. You'll probably just use moves and rolls to resolve those. Enough fluff, how do I shoot fireball? Okay, there are 4 concepts you should understand about the exchange system, each bringing you closer and closer to actually shooting that fireball. Avatar Legends combat isn't broken up in terms of time, so there aren't really turns. Each turn is a sequence of blocks, dodges, hits, and parries before backing away, catching your breath, and re-examining your opponent before going in for another flurry of blows. These are called exchanges. During an exchange, each involved combatant will have a determined amount of techniques that they're able to use. Once all combatants have exhausted all of their techniques, the exchange ends. Another exchange may occur directly after this. You don't have to be offensive in combat in order to be involved in an exchange. Protecting yourself is still engaging in combat, just from a defensive standpoint. If you choose not to enter an exchange while the opposing side is still attacking you, you're simply going to take all the hits and suffer all the penalties. A stark example from the show, Zuko did not enter an exchange against Ozai and their Agni Kai. Approaches are how you choose to, approach a fight. There are 3 approaches to choose between, which will determine when you act in an exchange and what techniques you have available to you during the exchange. In combat order, the approaches are defend and maneuver, advance and attack, and evade and observe. Okay, you've chosen your approach and it's your approach's turn to act in battle. Now you're going to go to the stance move. There isn't anything to explain here other than what's on the reference sheet. It does a very good job of outlining this move, so reference this table as needed. And finally, we get to techniques. These represent individual moves or actions within an exchange. They allow you to directly affect the other combatants or the environment around you, perhaps inflicting fatigue, conditions, marking or clearing statuses, or even shifting your foe's balance. Every combatant has access to the basic techniques. If you're skilled enough to fight, you know how to do these 9 actions. Additionally, each PC should have at least 2 advanced techniques. One is a playbook-specific technique that each playbook starts with, and the other is a technique that you're going to get to choose during character creation. fiction. For anyone excited about that, we'll be getting into choosing them very, very soon. All basic techniques are considered mastered, but advanced techniques can either be learned, practiced, or mastered. Functionally, the only difference between these three levels is what's outlined in the stance move. Learned requires a fatigue and a 10+ roll, practice just requires the 10+ roll, and mastered can be used anytime a basic technique could. If you get a 10+ on the stance move and pay the fatigue to use a learned technique in combat, it instantly becomes practiced. That means the next immediate exchange, you'll only need the 10+ to use it. Going from practice to mastered is a whole ordeal in and of itself, which is beyond the scope of your first couple sessions. You'll see that some advanced techniques reference attacks, such as whenever you attack, or a character who attacked you this exchange. An attack is any aggressive physical move against a target during an exchange that attempts to directly inflict a condition, fatigue, balance shift, or negative status. Actions that indirectly harm a target, such as smashing the ground beneath someone or trying to trap someone under a tree, are not attacks, even if they do end up inflicting a status or fatigue. The actual steps of an exchange are outlined pretty clearly here. The only thing I'd add is a step 0.5 where the GM sets the scene. This is establishing which NPCs are involved in the fight and what the surrounding environment looks like. If your GM forgets to share this information at the start of the fight, definitely feel free to ask. You don't want to run up to an enemy only to find there's no water for you to bend here. Throughout the game, but especially during exchanges, characters might find themselves subjected to banes or boons in the form of statuses. Statuses are specific states that apply mechanical effects to reflect the way a character's environment affects them. Statuses are always based on something that's true in the fiction. You can't just have the trapped status, there has to be something trapping you, and if the thing trapping you is removed, the trapped status should go away. While outside of combat, statuses will take effect as soon as they're true in the fiction. If you're inside of combat, statuses will be marked as soon as they're true in the fiction, but their effects don't begin until the end of the current exchange. For example, if you're stunned during the advance and attack approach, you won't be affected by it during your evade and observe approach. Exchanges represent actions happening almost at the exact same time, so status effects aren't going to come into play until the exchange ends. This can either be in the next exchange or in any non-combat moves that happen after the current exchange. The last thing to touch on for this reference sheet is a couple of questions that could come up when reading through some of these basic techniques. Specifically, Ready, Smash, and Bolster or Hinder have somewhat vague effects. Ready asks you to assign or clear a fictionally appropriate status. For once, I think the core rules actually explains this pretty good on page 154. When you use Ready, you set yourself or others up just as you like. Maybe you spread an ice sheet on the ground, setting up the other characters as impaired. Maybe you create your own ice weapon, setting yourself up as prepared. You can affect a group of foes or allies as long as what you do makes sense. Smash and Bolster or Hinder have pretty similar descriptions as well. These techniques require a lot of player creativity, as you need to be the one justifying how a status would be inflicted based on whatever action you took in the fiction. As always, if you're thinking fiction first, some fun and creative ideas should naturally come to you regarding these techniques. Think of how the benders in the shows manipulate the elements to change the battlefield rather than just punching each other. That's exactly what these techniques are made for. Now that we made it through all these rules, let's go to Appendix A and pick out those advanced techniques. When creating your character, you can choose either a universal technique on page 280, or you can skip back to one of your training-specific pages to learn a training-specific technique. Make sure to talk with your GM if you want to pick a technique with an asterisk in its name. These are rare techniques, so your GM may have specific rulings around when and where these techniques can be learned in their game world. Whatever technique you choose, you'll copy it into your playbook at the learned level. This is also a good time to go to the front of your playbook and read through your playbook feature along with choosing 2 playbook moves. Outside of training-specific techniques, you may have noticed a stark omission of bending in these rules. This is intentional. The game designers didn't want to put a limit on what you can do with bending, and they want you to be as creative as possible with how you could use it within the game world. Your GM may put some limits within the fiction on bending just to keep a consistent power level, but otherwise you should always be thinking of how you can use your bending in interesting ways. You shouldn't be thinking about how those ways will map to mechanics. That's the GM's job. You should just be thinking about how to use your bending in interesting ways to manipulate the world or your other combatants. In regards to combat, even the basic techniques should be thought of in terms of bending. Your version of strike as an earthbender might be throwing a rock, but a firebender could also use strike, and that would be shooting a fireball. If you're a bender, bending should fuel almost every single action you take within the fiction. You should be thinking about it in a free-form sense, unhindered by rules and mechanics. The fiction comes first. And there you have it. This should be everything you need to know to start playing at session 1 without too many hiccups. There are 4 companion videos I'll be making for players if you have the brain space to learn more, Otherwise, come back to these after your first or second session. As for my GMs, you have not gone unnoticed. While you have quite a bit more information to learn, I hope to be making similarly succinct videos to lighten the load for you guys. In my opinion, this game is much easier to prep for versus something like D&D, and the biggest hurdle is just that giant info dump when you're first learning a new game. So that said, stick with me and I'll hopefully have y'all ready to run the game within a couple hours. Otherwise, I hope to be seeing both sides of the table sooner than later.